Hello everyone and welcome to Net Zero Week, brought to you by YPO and iNetwork. My name is Duncan Spokes, the Commercial and Strategy Manager for YPO, and I'll be facilitating today's webinar entitled Getting to Grips with Environmental Social Value in Public Procurement. The UK is beginning its journey to net zero, and many public sector organisations have declared climate emergency, and recently the UK has enshrined new targets into law which will see emissions slashed by 78% by 2035. The UK's sixth carbon budget will incorporate into the UK share of international and aviation and shipping emissions for the first time, which will help bring the UK to more than 3/4 of its way to net zero by 2050. As we all know, the Social Value Act of 2012 ensures that the UK public sector organisations consider how social value deliverables, including environmental, are built into all public sector procurements. And the development of social value policies and increased visibility of procurement with service users focusing on these deliverables, we are now seeing more and more award criteria in procurement linked to social value. So today I'm delighted to be joined by our guest panelists, Jamie Cooper, who is a category manager representing Star Procurement, the shared procurement service for Stockport, Trafford, Tameside and Rochdale councils. Jamie works within the place category with a particular remit covering highways, civil engineering and facilities management. For Star, their regional environment remains a priority as part of the Greater Manchester devolution agenda. And as part of the combined authority, Star's focus is summarised in three areas: securing value for money and sharing expertise, investing locally to deliver social value, which includes environmental, and delivering excellence to our communities, which is around people, businesses, voluntary and social enterprises. So Gillian Askew, she's a director for Go for Growth. Jill is an experienced business leader with years and years of experience on boards and leadership teams. She was also my previous head of procurement services at YPO. Her core trade is procurement and supply chain, with a focus on socially responsible business development, sustainability, and has been working in this area for over 25 years, winning multiple awards for procurement strategy and business transformation. And finally, Richard Tabbets, who's the acting head of procurement at Birmingham City Council. He was also previously the head of contract management, and he is an experienced leader and procurement professional with over 17 years experience in both the public and private sector procurement. I'm really interested to develop with Richard a conversation around Birmingham's Clean Air Zone, which we'll get into later into the webinar. Richard had the skills and capabilities to initiate and lead on multiple council-wide projects and change programmes, which includes establishing new contract arrangements with wholly owned companies, the procurement strategy for the council's construction framework, and supporting the establishment of Birmingham's Children's Trust. So just a couple of housekeeping items to mention before we start. So as you can see, there's a chat box on the side of your screen where you can submit any questions you may have for the panel, which we'll try to answer at the end of the session. Depending on how many questions there are, we might not have time to answer them all, but we will follow them all up on an email after Net Zero Week. You can also see the menu icon on the top left of your screen to navigate back to the event agenda, where you can see all the up and coming webinars. And if you want to register for any more webinars, please follow the link at the bottom of your screen. So I'd like to start today's session, perhaps with the opening question to Jamie. So let us think about how we approach environmental deliverables at the initiation, concept or research phase of a new procurement. So Jamie, as a category manager with responsibilities for embedding and delivering council priorities across the 4 local authorities that are part of STAR, how does STAR approach this critical first phase?
I think really it comes down to 2 key factors for us, and that's both the stakeholder and then the market engagement. So from the stakeholder engagement side, social value, including all environmental factors, are always considered at the procurement stage, discussed at the initial stakeholder engagement. This is then captured within our procurement initiation documents, aligning with council priorities against some of the national measures. It does vary project to project, and it's understanding that requirements can change. But I think one of the key drivers is just to understand that social value is everybody's business, and it is something which everyone needs to take consideration for. I think historically we have had some resistance to social value. I think it's improved massively over the last few years. But I think one of it was down to stakeholders being a bit more commercial focused, just looking at getting the best price. One of the ways we've combated that since the inclusion of the social value portal is moving away from more of a qualitative social value parameters and having a bit more of a commercial aspect to that. We'll pick up on that bit a little bit later when we start to discuss around contract management. Within STIR, our social value approach is based on the national themes, outcomes and measures. And obviously there is a full section within that specific to environmental considerations, obviously including tackling carbon emissions and air pollution within them. A big task which we've done recently to help support us with that early stakeholder engagement has been mapping the council priorities against those national measures and then trying to have a look where there are some gaps within that and try and iron those out and work with the authorities just to ensure that we are meeting the priorities which we need to set out and achieve. I'd say some of those considerations which we've been looking at is the key ones are supporting SMEs, just trying to see how we can help them access funds and expertise for reducing carbon pollution. Most SME businesses could reduce their carbon pollution through fairly simple measures. So I think it is just down to us as an authority just to see how we can actually help support them and help them access the resources they need to be able to do that. We also are working with schools and encouraging them to cut their carbon emissions. Collectively, schools can reduce energy costs by, I believe it was around £44 million per year. And this is just through simple efficiency measures. And by doing that, we can help them prevent tons of CO2 from entering the atmosphere. Within my specific area, so as somebody did mention, it is highways and civil engineering, transport and vehicle procurement. It's around working with the councils to introduce measures to encourage cycling and walking, establishing urban consolidation areas, and then putting in electric vehicle points as well. One of my big jobs at the moment is actually working with one of the authorities to convert their entire fleet to electric vehicles. So it's during those initial stakeholder conversations where we can try and actually influence we possibly can. I think that takes it over really to the other side, which is the supplier engagement side, and I think that'll lead into some further conversations. It's something which we always consider pre-procurement, whether that's holding a market engagement event, a bidder's day, or just something as simple as having a request for information at that early stage, just to ensure that the supply market is up to speed in the same way that the authority is, and that we can align our priorities in terms of that as well. So I do have their own market engagement protocol, and that's something which we follow through with our stakeholders as well at them initial stages. I'd say in the last 12 months, one of the biggest successes is the market engagement we held in November. It's the first time we've had to do that virtually, but it was a great opportunity to bring in both external stakeholders and people from internal teams as well, and have a bit more of a clear focus on specific areas. And as part of that, we did have a number of different presentations around social value and ones very specific to environmental considerations as well.
Okay, thanks, Jamie. Really interesting points there around obviously that pre-procurement phase and actually making sure we've got those stakeholder engagement plans, measures in place. Jill, I think I'd be interested to understand from your point in terms of obviously SMEs and access to public sector organisations pre-procurement, to maybe sort of share some of your ideas and thoughts of how we could approach that supplier engagement to ensure that SMEs have got the opportunity to be involved, but also to ensure as procurers that we've actually got that full supply chain credibility.
Yeah, I mean, I think Jamie makes some really interesting points actually, and it's always great to hear about the pre-procurement activity. So I think one of my observations is, with 5.5–6 million SMEs in the United Kingdom, we have to harness the creativity, the innovation of that business community. We're not going to achieve the ambitions of net zero without doing that and doing it really well. The SME community are a huge force. They're responsible for something like 3/5 of the employment landscape, and over half of the private sector turnover goes through SMEs. So they're a key linchpin, I think, to what we're trying to achieve. But actually today looks very different for lots of smaller organisations than it did 18 months ago. You know, we are hopefully, fingers crossed, coming out of the other side of the global pandemic, but there was a recent poll that suggested that 23% of businesses have had to cut staff numbers just to survive the pandemic, and that 250,000 small businesses will actually cease to trade as a direct result of the pandemic. And 70% of business leader respondents to a poll said that climate initiatives specifically have had to pause because of COVID-19. That said, actually, in a local authority that I chatted to recently, climate agenda had actually climbed up the priority list because we'd seen what the power of lockdown 1 had on our natural resources. And so actually that had caused a strategic rethink in terms of the order of those priorities. So I think for me, there are some key words to unlocking the value that SMEs have to bring to this particular agenda and the wider social value agenda. And that's collaboration and consistency. I think what we see and what SMEs are telling us is that all too often the high level themes, and of course net zero is enshrined in law, it is, you know, we're unified in our ambition as a country to achieve net zero. But actually when that's distilled down into the procurement level engagement, the actual ask between contracting authorities can be different. So the how of getting there can be more challenging for small to medium enterprises if the message or the objective is inconsistently applied. And so I think there's something around that collaboration or creating a community so that there's a unified approach to delivering net zero and making it accessible to small to medium enterprises and the VCSE sector. One of the things that smaller organisations talk to us about all the time is how do they know what they should be doing? So we encourage thinking about two things. So what is the community in which you reside and what's the communities in which you wish to serve? And what are the ambitions of those geographical areas? So you can look at the local enterprise partnership strategic economic plan. You can find those objectives and ambitions fairly easily. But the question then remains, are those ambitions being mirrored in the individual procurements and in the pre-procurement activity? So if businesses are trying to reflect the net zero ambitions for the Sheffield City region, for example, or any region, are they clearly defined in the procurement project itself? Are they likely to have the right impact? If they're not, if there's a disconnect between the two, and that disconnect will always make it more complex and more complicated and therefore more challenging for smaller organisations. And of course, if they're not answering the procurement exercise, then we're not necessarily going to get where we want to go.
Okay, thanks, Jill. I mean, she makes an interesting point there, Richard, in terms of that engagement and actually the connection to make sure that those deliverables that are identified in the initiation phase are actually translated into outcomes. So in terms of your previous role as a head of contract management, I imagine it's incredibly important to ensure that those future deliverables can be monitored and managed.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely, Duncan. I mean, I think the question for me is where does pre-procurement start and contract management end? To me, they're very almost intrinsically linked. Pre-procurement for me really starts with good contract management, a part of which is not just having a thorough understanding of the contracts that we operate and the monitors, as you say, and making sure that they get delivered, but also broader market intelligence and knowledge of the category in general. I think building on Jamie's comments, it's also about working very closely with stakeholders so that there's that shared operational and commercial knowledge is particularly important. From a contract monitoring perspective, obviously, our approaches include checking with supplier deliverables, making sure they're meeting those social value targets, checking in with them on a regular basis, but also more broader regular engagement with the market, because that then provides us with a mechanism not only to validate that the agreements are fit for purpose, but also to ensure we've got an up-to-date snapshot of the market. And that's particularly important when we're thinking about new and emergent innovations, links into the SME community, and also what are the new ways of working out there in practice, particularly from an environmental perspective. I mean, the COVID's an interesting point in that actually for us, the services that were required and the ask of our suppliers during the COVID has very much shifted the emphasis slightly. So we're now thinking, well, actually, that the services that we provided in the COVID and we received from our suppliers, who almost has evolved into something completely different. So our recovery from COVID is very much about rethinking what we want from our contracts. So that's a key important factor for me. Also, I would draw back to, from an environmental perspective, it's about having that intelligence that we can get from the market. That intelligence then enables us to sort of shape the foundations for future contract specifications, and also what environmental and social value requirements we need to be considering and including in the contract, Duncan.
Okay, thank you. It's interesting there in terms of, obviously now we understand the importance of supplier engagement. We understand the importance of making sure that we involve SMEs in that process, obviously linking it to those deliverables which support contract management itself. But if we actually move this forward and look at the actual sourcing process, and by that I mean actually tenders, we're in a position to actually get ready to prepare for a tender. So how do we ensure that the business requirements that have been identified by a particular public sector organisation for their environmental deliverables, how do we ensure that they are actually captured? We've probably seen some increasing use of qualitative award criteria within tenders, and I imagine as we move towards net zero, we'll see more and more of that. But are these criteria effective? So what have we learnt in the past, either as a procurer, SME business advisor, or even a contract manager? Jill, would you like to sort of take that one first?
Yeah, I can do. So I've been chatting to businesses about qualitative measures versus quantitative measures. It's a particular topic that I think is relevant for me right now in terms of, when are we going to take price off the table and really look at value in all its glory, and then actually just see what the real cost of providing stuff and things actually is. But I started to think about this in terms of net zero, and actually there is some research that suggests in companies where they've got less or around 11 to 50 employees, the most commonly adopted measures for carbon is carbon reduction, energy reduction, and waste reduction. The same survey said that SMEs were overwhelmingly committed to the principles around carbon reduction, with 7 out of 10 businesses saying that they'd either already made that commitment or were about to make that commitment. So I think the answer for me personally is largely yes, qualitative approach, it's a sound one. However, in that same poll that I looked at, 82% of the businesses that responded also said they needed more guidance about how to achieve those qualitative measures. So I don't think the question is quite as black and white or as bland as qualitative versus quantitative. If we just picked one, qualitative, will that give us the necessary changes that we need to make? I don't know that it's quite that broad brush. So the question still stands for me in terms of how do we learn about how we make delivering net zero truly accessible to smaller organisations, whether they're a community-based or voluntary-based or a privately owned organisation.
Okay. So if we pick that up, Richard, in terms of obviously, taking that forward with SMEs, what's Birmingham's approach in terms of award criteria within tenders currently?
Well, we from a social value perspective, which includes our environmental elements, we target a minimum of 10%, but obviously that increases depending on the contract's ability to leverage net zero or or social value. Building back on my sort of previous comments about the market knowledge and the innovation, and picking up on Jill's points around guidance. Personally, I think from a tendering perspective, the criteria are only really effective if the questions are suitably challenging and drafted in the right way that teases out a sort of considered and well-structured approach. I think to ensure our supply chains are really committed towards net zero, it's simply not good enough to allow organisations to trot out their standard corporate response to social value questions. Organisations need to be really very clear about what commitments they're prepared to make, particularly at a contractual level, to support the tendering organisations, and that in turn, what is their ability to demonstrate that they can provide regular, measurable evidence to support the progress they're making. So I think, again, moving back to the sort of the tenderer side, this for me is about, and picking up on Jill's point about guidance, this is about tendering organisations ensuring that our social value commitments and targets are actually included within contract specifications. So it's us setting the decarbonisation social value targets, and that then makes it a lot clearer, and it's not open to interpretation by bidders, which we found in the past often results in sort of woolly statements that are difficult, if not impossible to manage. So for me, it's about us being very clear what our expectations are. That helps to guide bidders and really gives them absolute clarity on what our expectations are from a contractual perspective.
Okay, thanks, Richard. I'm interested, Jamie, because obviously in terms of your role at STAR, you're actually delivering service for 4 local authorities as part of a collaborative organisation. So what's actually your approach in terms of those business requirements then to make sure actually you've got that consensus across the 4 organisations?
Yeah, as everyone would expect, collaboration can be difficult, but it is at the heart of what we do. Obviously working across the 4 authorities, and then obviously working with partners across Greater Manchester as well. But it's also actually looking at the collaboration within the supply chain too. To pick up on what you've said there, we've just started doing work through the social value portal. So that's allowed us to now capture, in terms of the contract management, what our social value priorities are, and actually report back on that in a better way. It is the contract management aspect is managed by the service within STAR, so it's not managed directly through STAR. But by working with the social value portal, we ensure that we can clearly evidence now what is being delivered. And we have that, slipping up a bit there. We have that reporting mechanism in place for us to be available for us to actually do that. And obviously, each of the council's priorities are different. So, as I mentioned earlier, it's around having those early stakeholder engagement conversations to try and establish what it is we want to target on a project by project basis, but then looking at where that can actually be aligned and simplified in a way. Our social value now is a minimum of 20% across all procurements, and that's for all 4 of the STAR authorities. That's for anything below wall due or the UFTS as it is now. And that is split across both qualitative and quantitative. By the quantitative side of it, that is just quantitative values specifically to sort of social value deliverables, which we put in our tender documentation. And we will, whilst they are based off the national TOMs, we will actually look at amending them to suit each individual project, just so that we can get something which is more targeted for each individual project which we're delivering. I think by using the portal, I think that we have now evidence that we have achieved over £45,000 in commitments, specifically for environmental measures. £25,000 of that has been ratified, and we're waiting on the other to get ratified. But that is only a snapshot as well of what's actually been achieved since we've been using the portal too.
Okay. Thanks, Jamie. I mean, just as a sort of supplementary there, in terms of obviously your three sort of viewpoints there, I'm interested in terms of, what may happen with the new procurement regulations. And obviously, as UK exits from the EU procurement regime, and the consultations, obviously, for the Green Paper that are underway, being led by Cabinet Office, whether we think, Jill, that may give some increased opportunity for procurers within public sector to flex and develop to actually increase accessibility to SMEs?
I mean, yeah, the short answer is yes. It should. The regulatory environment isn't the thing that stops that, though, and I think it's worth making that point. This is, I think, what Jamie and Richard have been describing is about their approach, their culture, their value proposition, the values of their organisations, and their individual commitments to wanting to harness the power of the business market. Whether that is made up of SMEs, enterprise organisations, VCSEs, in all its glory. And so, yes, actually, the construct of the Green Paper will definitely, I hope it will remove some bottlenecks and start to shift some of that behavioural-led culture to show that there is, there's real possibilities out there. There's more flexibility than ever before. Use it, harness it. Let's get creative. And let's do what we need to do. These are difficult things to achieve. Net zero is not easy. And so we all need to be in it together. And anything that helps that, including things like the Green Paper, are definitely welcomed, for sure.
Okay, thank you. So let's move this on now to think about actually managing some of those deliverables as part of actually proactive contract management. And I'm really interested to sort of hear and learn about your experiences. And Richard, if I may start with you, looking at actually Birmingham City Council and actually how you've developed your approach to the clean air zones.
Yeah, no problem. I mean, the council announced a sort of climate change emergency in 2020, and since then we've established a Road to Zero programme team, which includes multiple initiatives around the decarbonisation agenda, retrofit of more environmentally friendly boilers for social housing, for example, amongst other things. But particularly from a procurement perspective, when we crunched the data, we found that 70% of the city's CO2 emissions comes from our supply chain. The largest proportion of which is obviously construction, building works, highways, and energy. So for us, and from a procurement perspective, this is about really how do we then leverage the contractual position, be it at the contract management stage or the procurement stage, to introduce targets that help us contribute to reducing that 70%, but also about delivering our Road to Zero objectives. But just by introducing some simple measures, we've saved 28,000 tonnes of CO2 by simply switching to green energy purchasing, which is a relatively straightforward activity. Equally, we've got forthcoming repairs and maintenance contracts, so we're including social value questions and also measures in there that really encourage suppliers to evidence that they're making a contribution to this, be it through use of electric vehicles, be it through environmentally friendly methods of building and construction. So it's very much at the forefront of our mind as and when we start a re-procurement. What are the environmental impacts of that, and how do we build in those targets? The difficulty, of course, is making sure that suppliers have got that data. So it goes back to my previous comments about setting our expectations very clear, and only working with organisations that are fully committed to delivering environmental objectives. That then in turn helps us drive the targets that we can monitor and measure and see a real improvement in the air quality of Birmingham.
Okay, thank you, Richard. Jamie, I'm interested in terms of actually moving this to looking where we've got a single organisation in terms of Birmingham there and their approach. How do you actually approach that sort of contract management across 4 local authorities who, while you obviously share a geographical location in terms of Greater Manchester, may have their own individual local sort of nuances?
I think it came down to doing that mapping exercise, to be honest. It was having a look at each of the individual councils' corporate priorities and then matching them against those national themes, outcomes and measures, having a look at where there is similarities within that, and then actually engaging with each of the authorities to see where we can actually capture that as a whole, as opposed to looking at it individually, whether that is to try and bring down cost efficiencies around it, or to try and just see whereby actually undertaking the collaboration, we can actually make a bigger impact by doing it that way. And obviously it is very difficult at times to get individual authorities on board when they have the different priorities. So that's why that we have to look at it at that initial stage to try and see where there are gaps and where we can actually try and influence in some way to try and get them on board, to try and do something together, to try and make a bit of a better impact in terms of that. And then again, really, it comes back to how if we actually approach that and the way we actually target the market through doing it collaboratively. By engaging with them at that early stage, making them know that there is different priorities amongst each of the authorities, and just seeing what is actually available for the providers to achieve on that.
Okay, so just again, Jamie, just in terms of sort of contract management then deliverables across the 4 local authorities, do each of the authorities have their own individual contract managers, or is that a shared function across the organisations? And also, I'm not quite sure whether you'll know or not, what's the relationship between STAR and obviously the the Greater Manchester Authority, obviously knowing that you've now got a mayor in place in Greater Manchester?
Right, okay. Sorry, can you just repeat the first bit on that, please?
Yeah, it's just in terms of the 4 local authorities. Do they have individual contract managers to support the deliverables, or actually is it a shared function across the 4 organisations?
It's not actually a shared function, no. The contract management is undertaken by each of the individual client departments. Whilst we will support them in terms of the social value contract management, which is delivered through the social value portal, the day-to-day contract management is actually delivered by each of the individual authorities. And that's where it can be difficult sometimes, even though we are a collaborative service, to align them contract management opportunities and aligning the council priorities. They would be managed individually across each authority.
Okay, and then just finally, then has there been any change, obviously, since devolution, obviously with Greater Manchester now, having the mayor, that relationship between STAR and the combined authority?
Of course, yeah, it is. Again, it comes down to that collaboration, all having a consistent approach on how things are targeted and having that mutual understanding on how we actually go about doing that.
Okay, thank you. Jill, I'm really interested to sort of develop with you, because obviously a part in terms of your existing role with Go for Growth, which is actually all about helping SMEs and preparing to engage with public sector organisations and understand obviously the opportunities that the public sector provides to those. You've actually run your own businesses in the past, and you've actually won local authority businesses through corporate tenders. But I'm interested to understand your experience of actually the contract management after you've won that business, particularly in relation to the environmental benefits. And is there any opportunity for public sector organisations, particularly local authorities, to refine, develop and maybe improve their techniques?
I mean, they get great questions, and I really agree with one thing that Richard said earlier in terms of the procurement process, that pre-procurement, where does that start and where does contract management end? Because they should be a continuation, shouldn't they, of the same whole. I think, however, that isn't necessarily the whole reality. So in my businesses, from a net zero perspective, if I take it in the specific context, I would look at the buildings that I got, the type of business that I was, the contribution that we thought we could make over time to carbon reduction and local ecosystems. And we believed, as businesses do, that we had a really strong and positive plan that we could talk about. But two things sort of stand out to me. It was difficult telling the public sector about the things that we were doing. And I also agree, Richard, that this isn't about trotting out your CSR policy. This was something very specific about what the contribution we were trying to make. I found it very difficult to tell that story because either the question wasn't asked at all in the procurement process, or it was asked in a way that meant actually we couldn't tell the story in the way that we were developing our own credentials to net zero. And then actually often, even when those things were included in the procurement, they would almost vanish from the contract management contingent. So you would answer questions around social value, around sustainability, around the environment. And my expectation as a procurement professional is that they would be the heartbeat as much as the core trade. They would be the heartbeat of actually what we were doing on a day-to-day basis. But actually they weren't always the things that people wanted to talk to us about in contract management. It was, volume metric type measures. It was, the measures that 20 years ago in procurement were the lifeblood of procurement. And now that we've moved on, talking about qualitative measures, actually, are you bringing those things to life that you said you would do? And are they having the contribution, the impact that you as a business want them to have, and we as a contracting authority need you to have? And so my experience is that's actually pretty hit and miss, I think.
I think that's a really interesting point, Jill. From our own social value journey here at Birmingham, we've gone through a number of phases of evolution. We very much started with the Birmingham Business Charter, which is 6 core principles that bidders potentially do make statements about. Then we found, well, that's great, but what's it delivering on the ground? What does it mean to the citizens of Birmingham? Which is then taking us through the next evolution into, setting our expectations at the tender stage and building in real measures that have that tangibility. And I think your point, that's really important. People want to know. People just don't want to dust something off a shelf from 2 years ago that said a potential bidder was going to use electric vehicles. It's this is actually about, well, how do we make this a living, breathing, if you excuse the pun, set of measures? It's a really, really good observation.
And I don't think we were in any way, shape or form unique. And I think it is, and it's a journey, isn't it? So this isn't necessarily a criticism of either the business community or the public sector, because actually you don't know what you don't know until you try it. And so you ratify those approaches in time. But, in Go for Growth, businesses genuinely are subscribing to the things that are important to our planetary resources, and really want to make a tangible contribution to the communities in which they serve. And the procurement process, the procurement environment in the public sector is the way that we do that. It's the way that we take our trade to the public sector. And so being able to, as you say, Richard, really understand what does it mean to Birmingham citizens? What will our communities look and feel like in all the ways that are important to us if we do this well through the procurement practices? And businesses are really up for that, is what I see. We were and are as a small business, and the businesses that are talking to us in Go for Growth are definitely up for that. Definitely.
Okay. Just interesting that, just to sort of develop this, and there's lots of, shall we say, money that's spent that's actually underneath, thresholds in terms of regulated procurement. So is there an opportunity for us to actually support that local regeneration recovery from COVID in terms of that, the local pound, so the Birmingham pound, the Wakefield pound, whatever that is, by actually, specifying some more of those environmental benefits in those lower value tenders rather than perhaps just focusing on, general service deliverables and price? I
mean, I think so. I think really flowing into any procurement, but definitely under threshold, we can think about, what are we trying to achieve in this particular geographical area? So what's right for Birmingham, the citizens, the communities in Birmingham, what journey are we on, where are we going? And I think what we've learned through COVID is that the business community, the SME community specifically, will stand up and be counted. They are really committed to the contribution that they can bring to the communities and the local economies, not just the ones that they live and work in as their heritage or domestic environment, but also those communities that they want to work with outside of their home boundary. And making sense of those things is, it's really important, super important. It's the way, it's for me, and it's just my opinion, but it's the way we will, we'll achieve what we want to achieve.
Okay.
We have actually had a big focus on that over the last few years as well. We've adapted our contract procedure rules for anything below OJU or FTS procurement now, so that it's a more risk-based sourcing approach. And alongside that, launched a local investment initiative, which allows us then to actually tackle, to target local and SME contractors, and then by obviously adapting our approach to how we go out to market and adapting our way we ask these type of questions and being more focused on specific areas, it allows us to obtain those deliverables.
Okay, thank you. So finally then, how do we think that the UK public sector organisations, as we move forward, will actually balance the cost of environmental initiatives? I was at a recent meeting with one of YPO's owning local authorities, actually listening to their sort of action plan around, the road to net zero after they've declared their climate change emerging. Some of the initiatives that they were obviously looking to deliver, there will be a cost associated to those, and obviously the payback to some of those will be over a period of time. So how do we think that we can actually balance the cost of those initiatives delivered through the procurement and contract management activity, particularly when procurement doesn't actually hold the budget? And our service users, as we recover from COVID, are going to be under increased financial pressure. So how do we ensure that those price drivers do not overtake and actually, if you like, subsume the wider environmental deliverables? Jill, do you want to take that one first?
I can do. I mean, I was reading recently in the Sheffield City Region Strategic Economic Plan that the cost of delivering the net zero clean energy objectives in that particular LEP region by 2040 will cost 1.7 billion, but the benefits will be 2.8 billion. So there is, there's a load of detail, obviously, that will sit underneath that isn't in the Strategic Economic Plan that says what the ratification of that is and what the timeline is. But I think I have always got a note of caution in terms of where the cost comes from. Because one of the things that we didn't do very well as a small business, and small businesses ask me often about, is that baselining, that measurement at the cost of the investment in it. If we've got price-led drivers in our procurements, do those two things just sit in direct conflict to each other? And actually, sometimes they just do. I've lived and breathed the psychology of pricing a bit that your business will rely on. It's really tough, because actually what you're on the hook to do is put a sustainable price in that means you can deliver all of the things that are in that contractual environment, but you need to win it. And so it's a tough ask. And I just Googled actually, what are the measurement tools out there for net zero? How do I measure my net zero impact? And there's lots of options, but they've all got a price tag against them. And small businesses will really struggle, especially in the face of COVID recovery, with any more price tickets. So I don't know that I have any, in fact, there isn't an easy answer, I don't think, Duncan, to it. But I worry that it will get lumped into the business community to foot the bill, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it's interesting now that you talk about obviously the price of measurement tools around sort of social value. So Richard, in terms of Birmingham then, I mean, that to sort of pick up on Jill's point there, how is the council actually approaching that balance between price and the environmental deliverables?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. I was at a SIPS event recently where the point was made that, procurement professionals are no longer just trying to get social value on the agenda. It's a recognised part of our profession and what we need to achieve for the stakeholders that we service. I think we've got the more broadly first, we've got the new legislation which moves from most economically advantageous tender to most advantageous tender. So that then starts to balance out the sort of price social value elements. For me, what's key here is encouraging the right types of discussions with stakeholders and potential bidders on three levels. Firstly, and this is how we in my mind, we compensate or balance the social value and pricing challenges. Firstly, it's about how we adopt commissioning approaches at the pre-procurement stage to make sure we're really thinking about the core outcomes that we want to achieve from our contracts and not just replicate what we've done before, because what we've done before certainly isn't good enough now or in the future from an environmental perspective. Secondly, it's about how we adapt our processes and behaviours to make sure that environmental matters and carbon reduction is really at the sort of forefront of our mind. And thirdly, going back to the point I made earlier, this is about having the market intelligence, having the engagement with the big blue chips and the SMEs to really understand what innovation is out there, because actually that's the way we balance the price and the social value. We think differently, we do something different, we're more innovative, which enables us to change the pricing mechanism to get better value for money. And I think in that respect, this is where the new post-Brexit procurement legislation is really going to help us, that ability to almost engage with our potential suppliers and the market to help shape the solution that we want. And that then would enable us to help shape the solution that is affordable.
Okay, and Jamie, obviously, again, focusing on STAR in terms of, for local authorities, I imagine you may have situations where you're with groups of stakeholders and actually trying to balance different priorities around cost and those qualitative deliverables.
Yeah, of course, it is always a major factor, and there has been more of a drive towards moving towards more qualitative. Obviously, price still needs to be considered, and we do need to demonstrate value for money. But I think by changing our minimum social value to 20% has been a key driver on that. And I do think it is something which will increase over time as well. I believe some other authorities within GM, that has gone even higher over the last couple of years. And I can just see it keep rising in terms of that, because it does need to be a clear focus. And all four of the STAR authorities and within wider GM as well, it is a major priority for them at the moment.
Yeah, it's interesting you say that. I mean, Jill and I were sort of reflecting on a separate session the other week around actually, there may be a time comes where we do actually see the 100% social value environmental deliverables within a tender, and obviously I think we've all seen some of the work that's been done. Particularly, I'm interested in terms of City of Manchester Council with their 10% into tenders around CO2 reduction. So you could imagine we are on that journey. So I think I'm interested to see how we progress. And I think, Jill, I imagine that the day will come soon where we may get that 100% social value tender.
I mean, I hope so, because I think there's some myth busting to do a little bit in terms of what do we expect will happen to the cost if we don't factor it in. Jamie's point is absolutely on the money in terms of value for money. That is what we've got to do as public sector buyers. It's taxpayers' money. We don't apologise for the governance or the structure or the focus that we place around procurement in the public sector. But until we try 100% value-led procurements, we won't actually know what that means to value for money or cost. So we think it might spiral a cost out of all control, but we don't know that to be true. Maybe it will enhance value for money. It will be interesting to see I don't want to use the word brave because I don't believe we should have to be brave to try something like that. But I guess there is an amount of realism in that statement. But I hope we do see that day, and I hope it's not too far off. I hope a contracting authority does say, do you know what? Actually, we're going to do it. See what happens. Maybe that would be good in an under threshold procurement, wouldn't it? Where the risk is relatively low. Sorry, Richard.
I think it's also about ensuring stakeholders and the business community and the citizens know what value for money means. Value for money means not necessarily just cheaper. Value for money is boosting the local economy, which value is a lot broader than the cost of an item, and it's how we then, as you say, myth bust or educate the organisations we work with to make them see that's value.
I think it's sorry.
Go on, Jamie.
Yeah, I think I was just going to point out from there, and I think it is educating the market, and I think they are getting better at that in terms of social value, by raising the percentages and such. That kind of shows how important it is for us as an authority, and you can definitely tell now with some of the tenders we put out where social value can be that deciding factor now, where when it was just at 10% and price was the main determining factor, it became a little bit redundant in some procurement exercises, where now that we have a quantitative and a qualitative social value attributed to every single procurement, sometimes it is what is the determining factor who win that procurement. So the market are getting more educated in it, but I do still think there is work to do in terms of that as well.
Okay. Jill, were you going to make a final point there, or?
Only that value for money is just really subjective, and it's our profession individually. We have notions of what value for money is, and the market do, and it is just about aligning those things through an education, and it will never stop. We'll always be doing that. It's our lifelong commitment, isn't it?
Okay. I'd like to sort of thank you all for your contributions today. Really, really interesting, and I'm sure we could carry on. And with the conversations, I think for me the takeaway points are actually the importance of pre-procurement research phase, making sure that we actually engage with the supply chain. And when we think about the supply chain, we mean that full breadth of, as you said there, Richard, earlier, blue chip organisations and SMEs, understanding the local priorities in terms of how we support to rebuild those economies after the impact of the pandemic, making sure that we specify those deliverables in our tender in terms of that balance between their value for money and the qualitative deliverables. The importance of contract management as well, to make sure that actually procurement is that full end-to-end process, and it's not just about putting a tender out there. And equally, the importance of actually getting that balance between that value for money price output with those qualitative deliverables. Okay, so thank you very much, Jill, Jamie and Richard, for your contribution. Found that really, really interesting, and hopefully our audience did as well. It's actually time now to start with a few questions, and I'm going to start with. Thank you. We'll now move into the questions and answers that have been posed during the webinar. And I'd like to start with a question to the panel around contract management. Contract management is highlighted as a major issue. Developing tools to capture, measure and monitor the social value measures is a priority, but without paying for an expensive SV platform, what advice do you have? Jamie, maybe you could take that question first and talk about STAR's journey.
Yeah, of course. As I've noted actually within the webinar, we do utilise the social value portal now, but obviously that hasn't always been the case, and it is something which was only implemented around 18 months ago. So we have had quite a history in terms of social value. I've been working with STAR now for 6 years, and when I first started, there wasn't really anything which was included in terms of social value, and it's something which has developed over time, gone from a qualitative question within tender responses, which was then somehow like embedded into the contract and monitored through KPIs, to us actually then incorporating the national TOMs. Obviously, there is a massive benefit in utilising the social value pool, in particular for helping to capture and measure in terms of the contract management side of it. But even prior to that, we was more in the early stages around this, utilising the national TOMs, capturing that information, and then working with internal stakeholders with how they could actually embed that within their contracts and set KPIs around the actual social value deliverables to ensure they were delivering that. So whilst it is great having an all-in-one solution and a contract management platform for it, there are still ways of actually working with that. And I'm pretty sure Duncan will be able to share a copy of those national TOMs for those who want to access them, to just see how it's an easier way of actually trying to capture that, and it can help form part of that contract as well.
Yeah, thanks, Jamie. I'll put a link to the TOMs in the chat. Jill?
Yeah, so I think, I agree wholeheartedly with what Jamie has said. For me, I guess we might go back a few stages. If you're at the beginning of this journey, it's really about being back to basics a little bit. Those values that you're trying to uphold through the contract management process in social value. So what are you trying to achieve? Why are you trying to achieve it? Who are you trying to achieve it with and for? And how do you reflect those things in your procurement process and contract management processes thereafter? And for me, thinking about, it's the market that delivers social value with and for us. So how do you engage that market? How do we challenge the market, inspire the market, and be ambitious with our desire to upskill around social value? And the TOMs will really help us define some of that stuff, but making sure that we're not over asking the market, setting the contract management process up almost to fail because we're over asking through the procurement process, of making sure that that stuff is proportionate.
Okay. And Richard, maybe you could share some of your experience in terms of Birmingham and your clean air zones?
Of course, yeah. It's a very interesting question, actually. Birmingham is, we're just implementing a new ERP system, and we've engineered some social value portal aspects into that, which will help us move from probably more of a manual process to something a little bit more sophisticated. But I think really for me, this is about two things. It's about building questions within the procurement exercise to ask the supply chain how they're going to measure social value, and putting the onus really on the suppliers. So from a Birmingham clean air zone perspective, we've set up air quality monitors across the sites within the city. That then enabled us to provide an initial benchmark of what our current CO2 level is, and it's against that we implement improvements to reduce that, and that will be measured periodically.
Thank you, Richard. We've got a really interesting question now. We alluded a little bit in the webinar around the shift and the move to potentially seeing tenders that are 100% quality. So questions come in. Do we agree now is the time for an environmental weighting on tenders? And if so, what percentage should be the minimum? Jill, would you like to take that one first?
I mean, the answer is, unequivocally for me personally, yes. We should be reflecting, social value, including environmental sustainability, carbon reduction in all of our procurements. And I think it's really subjective, actually. What I don't think there is a hard and fast, it should be 10%. There are authorities that are putting 10% to carbon reduction and net zero in procurements. There are organisations who are putting more in. So the government's put a mandate in for contracts over 5 million. Providers must have a net zero strategy. There are means to do it. And again, it must be proportionate to the contract and also relevant to the things that you're trying to achieve. But you heard me say in the pre-recorded bit that what would happen if we took price off the table? What would happen if procurements were 100% tailored to value, whatever value looks like? Would that give the market a different type of opportunity to really showcase what delivery could look like in these really important areas like decarbonisation?
Thanks, Jill. Richard from Birmingham, any thoughts?
Yes. Again, look, I don't think there should be certainly a set minimum. It's for me and the Birmingham is very category and tender specific. And we very much tailor our social value weightings, our environmental weightings to suit the service that we're requiring. I think just to build on that, because 100% doesn't go very far when you're splitting it across price, quality, environmental, and other social value commitments. For me, it's very much about how do we incorporate those environmental targets and commitments into the specification and into the contract conditions. So, when organisations accept a tender, they're by default accepting to sign up to those terms and conditions. So that way, it is potentially a way of getting greater emphasis on environmental issues into the contract without necessarily diluting other social value weightings.
Thanks, Richard. Jamie from Start.
To be honest, I'm just going to completely echo what Jill and Richard have said there. Absolutely, it does need to be considered. It needs to be a determining factor. What needs to be attributed, it though needs to be taken on a contract by contract basis. Obviously, in certain sectors, there would be a more emphasis on this than within others. It can be something as simple as just re-looking at, like for ourselves, it would be re-looking at what those national what the priorities are in terms of them on a contract by contract basis, and if there needs to be more emphasis on the environmental factors, that needs to be pushed and made clear within the tender documents that is what one of our major requirements are in terms of that. I don't know what my thoughts are in terms of a move to 100% on social value. Obviously, it's something which will create great value, but obviously in a time with massive budget uncertainty and things like that, cost does need to take into some consideration. But definitely in terms of environmental factors now moving forward, whether it has its own percentage attributed to it or it's just made clear that it needs to be a priority, I think that is a must.
Okay, thank you. Another question around the drafting of a social value policy and wish to emphasise environmental measures as much as possible as part of the Council's climate change action strategy. Did you have any advice and experience on how best to do this? Richard, you may want to take that one first, particularly with what Birmingham's done recently with the clean air zones.
Sorry, Duncan. Yeah, I lost you a little bit. Could you repeat the question?
Yeah, sorry. It's the council is drafting a social value policy and wish to emphasise the environmental measures as much as possible as part of their council's climate action strategy. Do you have any quick advice or experience on how best to do this?
I think it's the question is very much similar to the Birmingham situation. So we have declared a climate change emergency, and that has driven an action plan, a route to zero action plan and policy. And it's against that policy really where we start to shape and incorporate the environmental commitments and drivers into our contracts. So the elements that are due to be re-tendered, we're very much engineering environmental issues into the contract stage and the tender questions. Where we're mid-term with a contractor, we have to be smart about how we're gaining a bidder's commitment to deliver social value and environmental issues without increasing the price. So that might be through setting up independent climate change action groups where we've got 3 or 4 suppliers on a particular framework delivering housing repairs and maintenance. We're looking to set up an established committed group to deliver it. So it's thinking about different ways to
to weave in those targets depending on where you are in the contractual cycle. I hope that answers the question.
Yeah, thank you. I'm conscious of time in terms of we've got a planned 15 minutes for the Q&A, but we're approaching the end of that. So I think what we'll do in terms of that question, we'll pull together some additional information from the panelists and circulate that to all attendees of the webinar as part of the post-webinar package. Just a very, very quick final question, which is around effective contract management in IT. And any thoughts on the issue of planned obsolescence and how that plays into effective contract management? Jill, would you have any thoughts on that?
Well, so in IT, I mean, I was talking recently about reusability, that, you know, IT as a sector has got a great role to play in recycling and reuse and repurposing. There are some, you know, great materials that are just too good to go to landfill in IT. And so there are some great partners out there, some great opportunities to do more in the IT sector in terms of that recycle, reuse and repurpose. And there's, I think I talked about it on one of the other webinars actually, in terms of that product switching capability and how to think about that in IT. So there's definitely lots and lots to go at in the IT sector.
Okay. Jamie, then just to sort of bring the webinar to an end, then what's the approach of STAR in terms of IT and contract management? Do you have any insight into that at all?
It's not actually something which sits within my area, being within more the highways and civil engineering, but the fact that we are based around in a category specific setting, we do have a specific category manager for IT and such like that. But I think really in terms of the points what Jill raised, that it does need to be a priority, I think, in around the recycling, and it will be embedded on them individual cases for IT and very specific for that. It's just I wouldn't be overly clear myself on what they are for the IT, to be honest.
Okay, thank you. Well, what I'd like to do now is just thank everybody for your questions, and hopefully you've enjoyed the webinar today. I want to say thank you to Jill, Richard and Jamie for their help and support in terms of the webinar today. If anybody is interested in the closing panel webinar tomorrow at 10 a.m, which brings to the end to the Net Zero Week in partnership with our network, it's going to be a session that's chaired by YPO's Managing Director, Simon Hill. It'll be rounding up the week with a panel of local authority, blue light emergency service, procurement colleagues, plus some climate change specialists. So there's still time to register for that webinar on the YPO website. Thank you very much for everybody for attending this afternoon, and a final thanks to the panelists. Appreciate your support, and I wish everybody a good afternoon. Thank you.